So let's get rolling with today's program, Tips to Prepare Your CX Program for the Next Decade. I'm Tom Evans, and I'll be playing the role of moderator for today's webinar, and that features Stacy Bolger as our presenter. And I'll introduce Stacy a little more formally in just a minute. But before we get started, let me tell you that the webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive a link to the recording within the next 24 hours. And then secondly, we are planning to have a time for Q&A, a Q&A period after Stacy has finished her presentation. So if you have a question, you can submit it at any time during the webinar by just entering it into the question box on your screen. So feel free to send your question at any time, but just know we'll be saving all those questions for the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So thank you for hearing that. So let's meet today's presenter. It's Stacy Bolger, who is no stranger to MaritzCX webinars, and we thank her for that. But she is Vice President of Employee Experience at MaritzCX, where she provides vision and guidance for solution design, go-to-market strategy, and sales enablement to MaritzCX clients. She helps them achieve a holistic employee experience solution that is dynamic as well as supportive of their people, strategies, and initiatives. Prior to joining MaritzCX, Stacy spent 15 years in leadership roles as a CX and EX practitioner. She has a business degree from Marquette University in Milwaukee, and she is on the board of directors for the Western Wisconsin Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation and a member of the Customer Experience Professionals Association. So we are happy to have Stacy with us today. And Stacy, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to dive right in here, but I want to start out with some context. And as CX professionals, we have experienced a lot of change. Mostly for the better, let's be honest, mostly for the better, right? But across the last decade, it has been sometimes tumultuous, sometimes a struggle, but always, always exciting. And in fact, when I polled my local network about some of the changes that most resonated with them or that they recalled, they rattled off so many that we had experienced as practitioners and leaders of CX. Things like the debates, right, of whether or not we should call ourselves and call what we're doing customer service or customer satisfaction or something else. And obviously, we've landed on that something else, which I think is a good thing. Others recalled the massive 2+ page questionnaires that we used to send out by snail mail to customers. And then how that pendulum swung completely to the opposite side with the idea of there only needing to be one ultimate question, and you all know which one I'm talking about, before realizing that really this is way more about simple data collection for executive reports, that what we're doing is so much bigger and broader and more important than that. Others mentioned the massive efforts that organizations undertook to both create and then mobilize their CX governance councils. And then finally, and this is my favorite because I experienced this on numerous occasions, as some of you probably did, the battles in the boardroom, right, to secure budget for the, quote, soft measures of CX, end quote. And then the wonderful collaboration that was undertaken with finance and data science teams across the globe to be able to link CX to ROI, to get us really to the point where some of you may now be, where this connection is generally accepted, and now the expectation has instead shifted to optimizing this financial linkage through continual change and innovation in your program. So guys, on this line, we have absolutely seen a lot, and truly, unfortunately, we're a better community because we've had each other by our sides, learning and growing and leading in this CX space. But I think the best way to illustrate the amount of change we've seen and the pivotal point that we're at today in our CX journeys is to tell you a story about this evolution. Before we do that, however, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding the direction we're headed today. And I'm hopeful that many of you have already seen some of these objectives, and perhaps they're even the reason that you signed up to join us in today's session. Before we can identify CX's missing link and what it is that is bringing us to this pivotal point that we're at today, we first have to identify those capabilities that are really critical for CX success, for the programs that we run to truly drive ROI in our organizations. From here, We are going to talk more about that gap, and we're going to get really tangible with case studies to show you how these capabilities look and share with you the results that organizations like yours are seeing because of what they've been able to accomplish. Finally, we know that the change and evolution of our programs involves way more than just us practitioners. So we're going to talk briefly about who you need by your side as you go through this program evolution. So let's get on with the story, right? To set the stage, I want to let you know we're talking about a fairly large organization in the financial services space. The organization supports banking services for both personal consumers and commercial entities, and they leverage multiple channels in servicing their products. In addition, as this organization has grown, it has done so both organically as well as via mergers and acquisitions, which means, as we all know, that from foundational culture on through business strategy and leadership communication style, down all the way to employment practices and customer-facing processes, there's probably a lot of inconsistency across the organization, or perhaps there once was, and that's a little bit of a hint at what's to come. This is really where our story begins, and in preparation for the presentation, I had the opportunity to interview one of the executives who was on the forefront of this customer experience revolution when it began. The way he describes the beginning, which really was over a decade ago, was we knew what we wanted, but we really didn't know how much about what it took or it would take for us to get there. And indeed, isn't that the case for so many of us? It's truly a journey with a vision for what we think and believe good looks like. And when this new initiative, and I'm doing air quotes, I talk with my hands, unfortunately none of you can see that, but when this new initiative kicked off at this company, a huge big splash was made about this customer satisfaction score, and there was this massive cross-company training effort conducted, new frontline customer service standards developed, and indeed, that big, long survey that was mailed out to customers. So in the beginning, and as I say that, I think, gosh, it sounds like I'm reading out of the Bible, but perhaps we can call this the CX Bible, right? So at the outset of the bank's CX program launch, the focus was on accumulating data and really trying to understand what was important to customers regarding their overall satisfaction, and then reporting that information up to the executive team. As the work progressed, you'll notice that massive training event I referenced, and even an attempt to engage other business partners, as well as including HR. Unfortunately, at the time, that effort was rebuffed, and that may sound familiar to some of you in your own experiences. So this CX team again turned inside and worked on other stakeholders who they knew would be heavy consumers of the new insights: customer service teams, sales teams, product-focused teams. And in fact, a key win at this point within their process was the launch of several journey-based transactional surveys across their service channels. This was a big win. They now had others believing that this insight would be valuable to the business decisions that they were making. So as the program evolved, the program team's efforts moved from a heavy collection on data collection, or a heavy focus, on data collection and analysis, to leveraging those insights actually for the decisions and then changes to actions that were taken with customers. And to most impactfully and sustainably bring out the changes, the team built a best practices warehouse, and this was used by leaders across the organization to coach frontline performance against newly developed service standards. So you're seeing a lot of great progress made, not just in the collection and areas of collection, but truly in the way that they're employing the insights that they're learning. Once again, and you've seen this a couple of times along my roadmap here, with some use cases under their belt from the work that they've done with the service teams, the CX team approached HR. Again, to no avail. Unfortunately, the HR team just didn't want to be involved with the CX team at this time. So about this time, the organization had decided to attach incentives to their program. And I chuckle because as any of you who've done so know and maybe have experienced, it took a few iterations of this before they felt that they really got it right, helping to focus on the behaviors they were trying to drive versus simply the outcomes they were looking for. So as this roadmap goes on, you see that ultimately the CX team really tried to and was successful in building CX into the cultural fiber of that organization, going so far as getting into one area of HR, which was the hiring and performance management process. So they were able to embed some insight into those processes, as well as to make more strategic connections via the integration of other non-experienced data sources. So this roadmap is an absolutely simplified and not just 40,000, but probably 100,000 foot level of the roadmap that this organization took over the past decade plus. But here's the thing. They started to see their customer scores stagnate. And that is something, again, I'm sure many of you on the line have experienced. So here were some of the things that we started to hear. Our silos are killing us. Progress has stopped. We have too many divided priorities. Customer experience and our efforts have taken a back seat. It's certainly not unfamiliar. Executives are starting to ask why they're not seeing progress continue. It's beginning to feel, this is one of my favorites, it's beginning to feel like the focus is on the score, not the store, and call that what you will. But when the focus becomes on the score itself, we see a lot of bad behaviors start to build within organizations. And excitedly enough, there were some folks who said, we need to start talking about employees. We can't just keep talking about customers. We have to start talking about employees. So in working with this organization, we started to map their progress and the best practices that they had utilized thus far to our own capabilities framework, which provided some pretty interesting insight. That framework that I referenced, you'll see right here. And let me first note that I have absolutely not mapped all the best practices of the bank program to our framework. There wouldn't be space, there wouldn't be time in this webinar to do all that. But I wanted to give you a sampling. And the program's really knocking it out of the park in so many ways. They're leveraging the segmentation work they've done over the years to do things like churn analysis, and to apply interventions based on the use of AI tools. They have expanded their feedback collection outside of the survey realm into unsolicited data, and they've applied a journey framework to help their governance council best inform the decisions and priorities that this team is trying to manage. So one thing I'll say here is you can see that these capabilities and best practices don't exist in a vacuum. This is a very holistic framework. These capabilities actually rely and build upon each other, including this final capability, people, which is where our biggest insight arose. Of all of the phenomenal work that this team had done and was continuing to do, they had inadvertently left out a critical missing piece, the people. Now, of course, this does not mean, and I want to be very clear, of course, this does not mean that they weren't involving people in the work, because they were. Some of the story that I just told alluded to all of the different teams that they worked with. Nor does it mean that they didn't try to involve the people, because as you saw, even those who maybe didn't engage early on in this process, they did try to engage. But here's how critical this missing piece was. As recently as a year and a half ago, in an interview given to HR executive, the CXO of Marriott, who, by the way, this is not, obviously Marriott is not a bank, so this is a quote that is intended to illustrate the criticality of this capability. And I thought this was so poignant, the way that this CXO spoke. And I will note that this CXO was also formerly their chief talent officer and served them for many years as an HR leader. Pretty intriguing point there. So as recently as a year and a half ago, this executive gave an interview to HR executive. And what he did was state how strongly he agrees that the ideal customer experience can only be created by engaging the workforce. And here was his quote that I think is so incredible. he says, it's all about talent. It's all about the innovation engine that is created through the people that work in that company. And he goes on to say, if your employee experience is an afterthought, I don't see how you can expect the employee base to deliver on your aspirational customer experience. I'm just going to pause there for dramatic effect because it's such an important point to make. And here's the thing, that executive, that CXO, has not only the experience, but he had the data to back up the quote, as we do here at MaritzCX. We fielded the largest global CX practitioner study both in 2016 and 2018. And one of the things that we found was that indeed there is a really strong correlation between EX outcomes and CX outcomes. And that not only do they move in concert with one another, but that the stronger an organization was in driving results in CX, as evidenced by stage 4 that you'll see here as we rated organizations based on 4 different stages, the stronger also was their employee experience that sat at its foundation. So our research reinforced and validated that historical research that, and there's a ton of historical research out there, which is not where we're going to spend our time today, but it basically states that, hey, if employees aren't happy, customers aren't happy, and vice versa. And not only is there that relationship between your customer and employee outcomes, this positive relationship also translates all the way into business outcomes, reflected here on this slide. So just what are those organizational people capabilities that I keep talking about that are so fundamental to CX? Let's take a dive in here. When it comes to driving CX outcomes, we have got to get 6 things right as it relates to the people component of the business. I want to be very clear here. I want to clarify some things. That does not mean that if I'm talking about employee experience, I'm saying that these are the only 6 things to focus on to enhance your employee's experience. Not at all. In fact, employee experience is really another whole subject matter that I'm sure I'll be doing another webinar on in the future. So to be clear, what I'm saying is that when it comes to impacting your CX program, there are some key elements you have to get right for the people for them to be empowered, enabled, and engaged in driving customer outcomes. Those factors, as listed here on this slide, are the training that they're provided, the way that individual CX capabilities and skills are incorporated into the career advancement process, how the voice of employee about the customer experience is leveraged throughout the organization, how recognition for employee customer-focused efforts is embedded within the culture, and how CX performance is both evaluated and used as a factor in compensation throughout organizational performance improvement and planning processes. So that's a lot of information there, and I don't know about you, but I am one who likes to hear examples and case studies to help me better internalize this and really understand what this means and relate it to my own business. So let's do just that. Over the next several slides, I'm going to share with you several case studies and a minimum of 1 for each of the different 6 drivers that I just talked about. So let's start with the voice of employee driver. I like to start here because when I'm asked, and I'm asked this all the time, how all of this comes together, it's usually the starting point of any team working to embed employee experience into their CX program. In this example, our client runs a customer service call center. And for a number of years, they've collected customer feedback via their Voice of Customer program. This has helped them understand customer perceptions about the experience. It's given them insight into rep performance and really whether or not those customers' needs were met. Pretty standard stuff, excuse me. Additionally, as most good call centers do, and I have a background in them, so and oversaw this function, this one had a quality assurance team accountable for evaluating rep adherence to protocol, to policies and procedures, and to make sure that what reps were trained on was in fact being employed within the processes and in the day-to-day interactions they were having with customers. So for a number of years, these two pieces of data were used to provide coaching to the rep and to root cause customer issues. But in the last couple of years, the client has added a piece to help them triangulate this data. And that is a voice of employee survey, post-transaction, that the rep, him or herself, fills out regarding that transaction. Immediately, the company recognized and realized benefits from incorporating this into their process. They learned, when they triangulated this data, for example, that those customers who responded that their needs were not met, in fact, on those same calls, when they looked at the voice of employee survey, the reps noted that they felt frustrated they couldn't resolve the customer issue because they didn't have the authority necessary to do so. What powerful insight. I think back to my days within the call center environment and how much time was spent trying to root cause and understand why we weren't able to deliver a first call resolution in some cases that we should have been able to. Of course, there are the complex ones that are a whole other story. But in this case, they had their answer right there in front of them. But had they not had that voice of employee piece, they wouldn't have understood that it actually was an authority issue, that reps were not empowered to do what they needed to do to resolve very common issues that customers were coming forward with. On a secondary basis, and another benefit was that by providing these reps an opportunity to use their voices, the call center saw engagement scores spike because, frankly, employees now feel that they're part of the solution, not just the recipient of other people's perceptions of how that interaction went. So they feel like they have a voice in play, which is a huge factor we know of employee engagement. Okay, so I promised you at least 6 best practices, and I'm going to give you a 7th because I believe so strongly in the voice of employee driver that I wanted to share an additional case study associated with it. So you're going to get 2 related to this voice of employee piece. And one of my favorite case studies in this space involves another global banking study. And this is a team that has done a lot of work over the years. They have a voice of customer program. They have a voice of employee program. But for many years, it was run separately. And when it was brought together, they now report the data together. So in any sort of dashboards and ad hoc reports that come out, they report both CX and EX data together. But they built both EX and CX data into organizationally accepted processes by which decision gets made and work gets done. So this company, just to get real specific with you, they do daily huddles with all of their teams as the day begins. And they leverage these huddles to communicate, to evaluate, and to plan for their work each day. That conversation, I'm sure, originally began with just utilizing operational data. But over time, it's evolved. And now it includes not just operational data, not just voice of customer input, but also voice of employee data and insights. And what I think is so powerful about this example is that they are truly practicing. We talk about how both CX and EX need to be embedded into the culture and the fiber of that culture in order to truly take hold. They are building into their culture the power of the voice of each employee because they practice this every single day. And in turn, it's empowering their people. Their people know their voices are heard and further engaging them. So they have seen their engagement scores jump as well. All right, let's move on to the element of training. So the case study here demonstrates the importance and the criticality of incorporating training, not just after the fact and not just on a regular basis, but truly into program design and launch plans. Several years ago, this client was in the process of bringing pretty large-scale change to their program, including a shift in collection modalities and redesign of existing surveys. And many of us who've been through that know that that's a pretty big effort. So as part of this process, and the way that the team went about designing reports and the dashboard design process, the team interviewed key stakeholders at all levels of the business to gain a clear understanding of the types of decisions they needed to make and what insights they hoped to have in making those decisions. But the team didn't stop there, right? So it's one thing to gather the information and incorporate it. But what they did is they built a deliberate training strategy then to help those key stakeholders understand what they were being provided in the reports and dashboards that ultimately came out. And the way that they did that, this training strategy involved executive sessions, it involved webinars, and it involved in-person trainings to help each team understand how to leverage the dashboards in their day-to-day work. And as a result, even as response rates skyrocketed, the team felt that they were well equipped to consume and to use the new insights. And the way that this was measured and the evidence that was shown was by program adoption rate. And I think the two key components that came out of this was not only how critical training is, but also as a bonus, how critical executive support is, and not just executive support, but truly executive endorsement. So definitely a key factor in relating to people and empowering them to best utilize the CX data that is being provided. All right, let's move on here. In this next case study, this is a hospitality company that has long been, while I'm not using brand names, some of you may be able to pick up on who I'm thinking about. But this hospitality company has long been a case study, not only, and a favorite case study, if you will, not only used by our group of CX professionals, but even by universities within their coursework to demonstrate the strength and success of an organization built on the principle of complete customer satisfaction. And frankly, I could have probably used this case study across any of the capabilities that we're talking about today, but I wanted to use it for their well-known approach to advancement that they take. So from the moment employees are hired at this organization, they begin their enculturation into what complete customer satisfaction means. And that's done in a number of ways, but some of them are the branches themselves being ranked, employees individually being ranked, and as a part of that, the ranking, the assessment of employees and their focus on customers, that performance is used as a key factor in any and all career advancement and promotion decisions. And in that way, employees from the day they begin with the company know this is what is important in my role, and if it's not something I'm willing to commit to, I likely don't have a future at the organization. So this is one that I think is a fantastic illustration of an organization that from the ground up builds advancement into the process of CX success. All right. Thanks for sticking with me, folks. There's a lot of case studies, but that's because there's a lot of opportunity to talk about how organizations have had success in building these capabilities. Our next case study uses a company that is well known for its cultural orientation, not just to CX, but also to employee experience. And this is why they're such a great example and why I wanted to use them to demonstrate the criticality and success in building recognition into truly the way that they work and interact with each other on a day-to-day basis and in their work every day. This organization's philosophy on recognition, which is, by the way, done peer-to-peer, it's done leader to employee, it's done employee to leader, and it's done company to employee. So it's done in aggregate and also on a very individual basis. So their philosophy is that recognition breeds ownership. And that's an interesting principle. It's really that if employees are truly empowered to take action and make decisions, and then are recognized for their successes, it will contribute not just to their continued engagement, but also business growth. because again, if they are recognized for the good decisions they're making, they will feel empowered and strengthened and supported in continuing to make the decisions and take the actions that they are being asked to do on a day-to-day basis within their roles. And I may give you a little hint here, but I can share this because indeed this individual said this publicly. So Richard Branson himself has said very publicly that by taking care of employees at Virgin, that everything else will take care of itself. And stepping back from that comment, because in theory it's a fantastic statement to make. Talk about somebody who backs it up. With a net worth of nearly $5 billion, or approximately $5 billion, probably more at this point, it's pretty hard to argue with that proof point, in my humble opinion. All right. This next story is one that we're going to talk here about aligning compensation effectively. And back in my practitioner days, I could only have dreamed about bringing this about within my own organization. So a key contributor to this software company's success has been the appointment of a single officer, actually, in charge of both customer and employee experience. And while that is becoming more and more frequent, at the time when this was done, it was not as well known a practice, but it was definitely a factor in what they were able to bring about. One of the major innovations, actually, that they launched under this executive had been an effort to align compensation awards more closely with metrics tied to servicing and building relationships with the customer, as opposed to the way that we more traditionally maybe align compensation, which is to measurements like sales, revenue growth. And so in this way, what this executive has been able to do is bring about teams and all teams, right, that are focused on retaining and building the customer base, the customer base, and not solely that short cycle sale. So because this one was super intriguing to me, I had to dive deeper, and I wanted to provide you with a little bit more information about really how this was brought about. And the way in which this individual has done this on the surface is seemingly simple. Yet, as many of us in these roles can attest to in our own organizations, it may feel like it could take the moving of a mountain to bring about such powerful change. Every single employee, so first of all, every single employee has some sort of incentive compensation tied to the customer. Every single employee. And not only that, because tying to it is one thing, but helping people learn what that means and how to behave is an entirely different thing. And what they've done is that within the company's intranet, they have tangible examples of what each employee should be doing specific to their role to impact customer experience. And again, pretty easy to do if you are talking about a servicing organization or a sales organization. But the example that I really liked was even citing the finance and the contracts teams, which frequently may struggle being a non-customer facing entity to make this connection. So what this executive says is that this includes finance employees developing payment terms that are easier to understand and use, simplified contractual terms coming from the legal department, and more personalized approaches to consumers from marketing, or HR, hiring more empathetic staffers, building the empathy capability into their hiring practices. So while the aligning of compensation and incentives to CX has long been a discussion and frequently a debate, what this capability and what this case study here illustrates is that when it's done in such a way as to drive the right aligned behaviors, and that aligned piece is really key, remember, because we're not just talking about certain parts of the organization, that when it's done in such a way that aligns them, it can drive a super positive CX across the organizational silos. And this company demonstrates just how effective that can be. All right, moving along, and I think we're actually getting to our final case study here. And I'm actually going to end this case study where I began. So I'm going to go back to the bank, the regional bank that I spoke about in the introductory story, and I'm going to take you one step further in their evolution process at their CX program and the outcomes that they've achieved. You'll recall that in our work with this organization, we determined that this program's plateau was indeed a result of a gap in their CX capabilities related to their people. So while the organization undertook several efforts, so this was not a one-dimensional effort, one of those being the build of a more comprehensive voice of employee program, in fact, the effort that I want to highlight here is actually a change that they made to help bring customer centricity to the forefront of their culture. This team designed a new organizational competency related to customer centricity. And not only did they design a competency, they took it so far as to outline behaviors and desired outcomes. So they really got specific with what they were looking for. This competency was built into every single employee's job description, from frontline employee all the way up through the CEO. And in this way, now not only was every new hire evaluated for these skills, right, because it was in the job descriptions that were posted for open roles, they were also evaluated on it by peers and by their leaders throughout each year in the performance management process. And in this way, they kept it in the forefront of the employee capabilities from hire all the way to when that employee would, in effect, retire. Hopefully on good terms, but we certainly know that if they weren't meeting the competency requirements of customer centricity, they unfortunately might not make it to that retirement point with that organization, which really speaks to how they embedded evaluation of behavior specific to the customer into the very fiber of their culture. All right, lots of content and stories of organizations who've just really kind of figured out how to build out those 6 key capabilities to best help employees drive a superior customer experience. So hearing this, what's next for some of you? And I would imagine that many of you on this call are probably at different stages within the roadmap that I showed at the outset of this session. And probably some of you have fantastic successes that you could share, or even best practices that you've done within your own organizations. But there are going to be some of you on this line probably who aren't quite sure where to begin. And so I added this last part to our session today to help those of you who are new to this identify one of the key elements to consider as part of this process and what your next step should be. And that is really who you should be involving in a part of your efforts. So here's the thing, because as you look at this slide, you're probably seeing the names and titles and thinking, well, gosh, that's everyone in my organization. And indeed, that's the case. For CX to succeed, we do need everyone in the organization on board. But the hard part here is really understanding the needs of each critical stakeholder group. And that's where I wanted to focus and note on this slide is if we had to engage some of these key stakeholders, they may not speak the language we do. They may not see what we do. And in fact, speaking of that, outside-in thinking, which is a capability that so many of us on this call are probably really adept at, we know that that's a learned behavior, that not everyone within our own organizations understands how to think outside in. And so I thought by talking about the needs that are the priority and focus of some of these stakeholder groups, that it might give us some ideas on ways to approach them and engage them in our work. So let's start in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, HR. Because if we're talking about people, they're generally the first ones that come to mind within your organization as a key stakeholder. And what these folks are really looking to do are build the skills and competencies for the long-term success of the organization. They're looking at not just on a day-to-day basis decisions that are made, but truly how we get people in the door who have the right hard and soft skills to help develop the leaders that the business needs to grow and thrive. They're also the ones who are going to be likely accountable for overseeing things like organizational design and change management. And so those are all going to be important pieces to keep in mind when we start talking to them about bringing together disparate data sources and trying to leverage data in new ways, because they understand that by learning what we might need to change in terms of the behaviors of our employees is not a small effort. So things to consider for HR. Moving down to the bottom left, where we have the executives. And, at the end of the day, the CEO's job and the executives is to deliver business results. The key way in which they do that is to lead the development of the culture and the strategy that aligns with that culture to bring about the organizational results. And the way that they do that is by creating that environment where not only employees are able to do their jobs, but again, provide that culture within which they are able to do their jobs very well. All right, I'm seeing a note from my marketing team that I may have lost you guys there for just a short period of time. I do apologize. The good news is we are recording this. You will all get the recording. And if there is something that you missed that you really wanted to hear, make sure to mention it in the question box, and I'll do my best to repeat what it was that I might have said. So I apologize for that technical glitch. Let's go up to the top box here on the right and talk about the CX team, which is probably many of you on this line. You maybe are part of that team or you lead that structure within your organization. And I don't need to tell you what your needs are, right? But at the end of the day, you're looking very holistically. And as somebody who has been in leadership roles both on the customer side and on the employee side, I can tell you that when I start talking about holistic, it means different things in different structures within the organization. So I find in terms of the CX team, one of the best things to do is to inquire, curiously inquire, ask the questions. When you are describing a vision, making sure that we're very clear in what that vision looks like. So when we say holistic, what does that really mean from the listener standpoint? All leadership, bottom right here of the slide, all leadership. Well, again, when we start talking about cultural change, we know that the behaviors, the words, the actions that leaders take all contribute to or take away from the culture that we're trying to build. So leaders are a critical factor in bringing about CX success, and probably are in the best position to be able to do that by taking ownership of the employee experience and helping understand what those employees, rightfully so in the middle of this slide, need in order to be able to feel enabled, to be empowered, and to be engaged in bringing about success for the customers and then ultimately the business, and hopefully fulfillment for themselves as employees. So before we get into the Q&A, I just have a thought-provoking question that I want to leave you with, which is, as you look in your organizations to 2020 and beyond, how are you both leveraging but also incorporating people into your own CX program? And with that, I will turn it over to the Q&A portion of the session for any questions that you may have.
Hey, super, Stacy. Thank you so much. Yeah, good intro into the Q&A. You know, we've long contended the importance of making these critical connections, but really appreciate the case studies and the new insight, and just that keeps confirming the importance of this relationship. So, yeah, we had many questions come in so far, so let's get started. This person says they've struggled to get their HR team on board with the ideal of experience management, but they do run an annual engagement survey. Any ideas on ways that they could try to engage them?
Yeah, so the key there, right, is to find that, first to find a willing player. And it may not be that you're able to engage the entire team all at once. So I know that when I was in this position, one of the things that we often talked about was starting small and seeing what we could build from. But I think, given that this individual is saying that they have an annual employee engagement survey, so they already have a data set. One suggestion may be to thematically look at what their CX data is telling them and what their EX data is telling them, right? So this is pretty low effort. It can get more involved, but doesn't have to be on the surface. But taking our insights are the key priorities that are emerging from both CX data and EX data, and looking at them for where we might identify themes or mutual points along the way is where we can really start to align potentially some areas of mutual interest and, in fact, accountability. So I think that's a big piece to that, as long as there are two data sets, is to just look at this on the surface for where there might be mutual benefit. And the example that I used related to the call center is a good tangible example of that. Employees are saying, now that happened to be a transactional voice of employee survey, but perhaps also in the larger engagement survey, that organization found that their employees didn't feel as though they were empowered to do what they needed to within their jobs, or that they didn't have the right technology or the right tools in order to make the decisions they needed to make, whereas customers were saying that their issues weren't being resolved. That would be an area of mutual opportunity that could at least get a conversation going, and that then would resonate with both the CX team as well as the HR or EX team.
Okay, great, thank you. Earlier on, you talked about milestones. How long did it take to achieve those milestones?
Yeah, so the organization that I was using in that case, and as I mentioned, I was really at a 100,000-foot level because, boy, if we wanted to talk details about some of the efforts that were undertaken, the projects, the structure work that was done along the way, there was a lot of stuff that took place. So we're talking that over a decade worth of change in which those milestones took place. Now, the milestones themselves were not intended to illustrate years, because I'm sure some of you looked at those, you probably went, well, gosh, that seems out of sync based on what we did within our own organization. So note that wasn't intended to illustrate years, but it was over a decade worth of change in which some of those changes were made. And truly, this is an organization who has built CX into their very being and their culture. So I read somewhere one time, this was many years ago, that it takes cultural change 7 years to fully take place. And I think that this example illustrates and is a good case study that demonstrates exactly that when we're talking about building it into hiring practices and employee performance assessments and compensation decisions, that took a long time to get there because it took engaging the hearts, the minds, and the behaviors of every employee within that organization.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stacy. Can you give some examples of relationship building metrics?
Oh, goodness. Let me think. So this was an organization. I'm gonna take this one offline, Tom.
Okay.
Because this was a case study that was out in the public domain that I leveraged. I want to make sure that I'm giving credence to it and not speaking out of turn. If it was our own data, not that I would want to speak out of turn, but it would be something that I would be probably far more well versed in specific to this organization. So I want to take that one offline if that's okay.
Oh,
and
perfect.
we will make sure that we send that out in the email that when we send out the deck to everyone.
Okay, cool. So next question, we have just started down the EX path, and our HR team is involved, and they're currently doing an engagement survey every 18 months. What thoughts should they consider when deciding where and how to start building a more holistic program?
Yeah, I'm actually involved in a lot of these types of conversations right now. And I will say, for those of you who have been in the CX space for any period of time, you will recall the days when we wanted to be able to serve this thing up done and beautiful and on a silver spoon right from the get-go, right? We wanted to go 0 to 100, or maybe we didn't, our executive teams wanted to go 0 to 100 within the first year of the program, the first 6 months of the program. And we're seeing that be the case in a lot of employee programs right now as well, where somebody says, hey, we're doing this, all we do is an engagement survey, or we might do an engagement survey and an onboarding survey, but we're doing nothing with unsolicited data. We're doing nothing around actually utilizing the data, and yet they're looking to build a holistic program. So, admittedly, in this with that context, in this webinar, some of the practices that I spoke about were pretty sophisticated for some who are early in either their CX journeys or their EX journeys. And so I think the best way to start is to begin building out a voice of employee program. Try to understand what employees are saying about their own experiences and what engages them within the workplace. What are they saying about the customer experience? And what can they tell the company about not just what they're hearing, but what they may be experiencing as customers and as employees. So I think the Voice of Employee program is the best place to start, because employees can tell you a lot about what we need to be prioritizing, both to engage them as employees, but also to help retain customers.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question, do you have any statistics and or maybe some resources that this person could share with their leadership team on why focusing on a customer-centric culture is kind of a no-brainer?
Absolutely. We actually have some great data, and I referenced that study that we had done both in 2016 and 2018, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. This was a study that was done globally. It was done across 40 plus industries, and our target respondent was really any role or individual who was involved in running, administering part of a CX team. So we were gathering insight from CX practitioners. And what we found was at the highest of levels, there were 6 key capabilities that were a requirement for an organization to drive ROI leveraging their CX program. And those were the 6 key capabilities that I showed early on in that circle diagram as a part of this session. So because we had such robust data and we knew what capabilities were important, we then were able to run quite a bit of analysis regarding the financial impact of different best practices, of different capabilities across industries. So different industries, had a different set of capabilities and best practices that were most important to driving ROI with that CX program. So we have a number of different statistics and data and whatnot we can pull from that study. So with regard to that question, I think I would recommend, I think we have contact information coming up, don't we, Tom? I think, on this. So here's my information, but we also have, when you get this, when you get the slide deck and within 24 hours, we should have contact information in there. And I think it would be best to talk about, what are that individual's or that organization's, maybe some hangups. What are the obstacles and the stopping blocks that is preventing this from being seen as a no-brainer, so that we can employ the right mix of proof points to help make that case.
Great, thank you. And we are coming up to the top of the hour, so there will be definitely questions that we did not get answered today. Again, we'll be getting back with you individually on those questions and with answers. So maybe we can make this one our last. Organizationally, where should a CX program reside, in your opinion? So this person said they've read articles that support that CX should be its own entity, that has a seat at the executive table, and that it can reach across all areas of the organization, so not siloed. So what are your thoughts on that?
At the highest level, so this is truly one that I would love to have a roundtable with many on this call about. At the highest level, I think it is incumbent or dependent upon the culture of the organization. So I've seen it run as a part of the marketing team. I've seen it as a part of a customer service team. I've seen it as part of an executive team. I've seen it as part of the HR team. I've seen it in any number of different places. And I think the key is understanding where that individual and where that team is going to have the best opportunity and advocacy for what they are trying to share with the organization. I think the linkage to the executive suite is absolutely critical. I think many of us have probably been in a situation where it was a part of a team, but it was linked up maybe through the customer service team or the sales team up to the C-suite. And frankly, CX rarely gets a voice when competing against sales. So I think that linkage, a key principle or foundation that needs to be considered is having a seat within the C-suite. But I don't think that necessarily needs to reside on its own. It just depends upon how that organization works. So I've seen it succeed in many different ways.
Good, super, great insight. And so that's going to do it for today. I want to thank Stacy for a great presentation and for all the work that you did, Stacy, in putting the content together. It was great. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today on today's call. And hope that you'll look for the next invite for the March 12th webinar, as we promoted earlier. And until then, hope you have a great day. Thanks again.